What happened when King Charles III, frustrated during a major royal ceremony, tried to silence a royal guard who was simply following protocol? The guard's response was so unexpected, so perfectly professional, that it changed how the monarchy works with the military forever. Palace insiders say it was the most tense moment they'd ever witnessed between a monarch and his guards, but what came next surprised everyone. Before we dive into this unprecedented royal confrontation, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. The morning of November 15th, 2023, dawned crisp and clear over Buckingham Palace, the kind of perfect autumn day that royal ceremonial planners dream about for state occasions. King Charles III stood before his dressing mirror in the royal apartments, adjusting the heavy ceremonial robes that still felt foreign after decades of waiting. At 74, he was the oldest person ever to assume the British throne, and every detail of every ceremony felt magnified under the scrutiny of a world watching his every move as the new monarch. The state opening of Parliament was scheduled for 11 a.m., a ceremony steeped in 500 years of tradition, where every gesture, every step, every pause had been choreographed with military precision. Charles had participated in this ceremony dozens of times as Prince of Wales, but today was different. Today, he would wear St. Edward's crown, carry the sovereign's orb, and deliver the Queen's speech that would outline his government's legislative agenda. The weight of constitutional monarchy rested quite literally on his shoulders in the form of the £5 imperial state crown that would sit on his head for the duration of the ceremony. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton reviewed the schedule one final time with His Majesty, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone who'd orchestrated royal ceremonies for 3 decades. Your Majesty, the procession begins at precisely 10:30 a.m. The household cavalry will lead, followed by the Irish state coach carrying Your Majesty and the Queen Consort. The Royal Guard contingent will maintain ceremonial positions throughout the procession route, with particular attention to the palace gates where the largest crowd is expected. Charles nodded absently, his mind already focused on the speech he would deliver and the symbolic weight of his first major parliamentary appearance as king. He'd practiced the timing repeatedly, knowing that centuries of constitutional tradition demanded perfection. The British public, still adjusting to his reign after Queen Elizabeth II's passing, would be watching every detail, every mistake, every deviation from the flawless execution they'd come to expect from royal ceremonies. Lance Sergeant James Mackenzie stood at attention in the palace courtyard, his scarlet tunic immaculate despite the early morning preparation that had begun at 4 a.m. At 28, he was a 10-year veteran of the Grenadier Guards, one of the elite units responsible for royal protection and ceremonial duties. His bearskin hat, standing 18 inches tall and weighing nearly 2 pounds, had been brushed to perfection. His brass buttons gleamed like mirrors. His white parade gloves showed not a speck of dirt. Every piece of his uniform had been inspected, re-inspected, and approved according to standards that hadn't changed in 200 years. Mackenzie understood his role with the clarity that came from years of training and tradition. During the state opening ceremony, he would be positioned at the grand entrance to the palace, maintaining absolute stillness and perfect military bearing while the king and queen consort departed for Westminster. His job was to embody the unwavering dedication of the British military, to stand as a living symbol of the armed forces' loyalty to the crown, and to execute every movement with the precision that had made the Queen's Guard legendary worldwide. The morning briefing had been standard. Maintain position regardless of weather, crowd noise, or distractions. Do not move unless ordered by a superior officer. Do not respond to public attempts at interaction. Maintain the dignity of the regiment and the crown through absolute professional discipline. These weren't suggestions. They were orders backed by centuries of military tradition and the sacred oath every guardsman swore to defend the sovereign. But this morning felt different to Mackenzie, though he couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the energy around the palace as staff prepared for Charles's first major ceremony as king, or the extra layer of security protocols that had been added since the transition of monarchs. The king himself had seemed more involved, in ceremonial details than his mother ever had, asking specific questions about timing, positioning, and protocol that suggested both genuine interest and nervous attention to detail. As Mackenzie took his assigned position at 9:45 a.m., he noticed the unusual number of royal staff members positioned around the courtyard, their clipboards and stopwatches indicating that this ceremony was being monitored more closely than usual. Assistant private secretaries stood at strategic points, ready to coordinate any adjustments that might be needed. Palace photographers documented every angle for historical records. Even the normally invisible housekeeping staff lingered at windows, understanding that they were witnessing something significant in the evolution of the monarchy. The king appeared at 10:15 a.m. for the ceremonial inspection, 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Charles moved with the measured pace of someone aware that every step was being observed and recorded for history. His uniform was flawless. Dark blue ceremonial dress of the Royal Navy, with the blue riband and Star of the Order of the Garter across his chest. The weight of constitutional responsibility was visible in his careful movements and focused expression. Mackenzie stood at perfect attention as His Majesty approached, eyes fixed on the horizon according to protocol, aware that the king was examining not just his uniform, but the entire ceremonial setup that would soon be broadcast to millions of viewers worldwide. This was the moment when theoretical preparation met real-world execution, when months of planning would either achieve the flawless dignity the monarchy required or reveal flaws that would be analyzed and criticized for years to come. Charles paused in front of Mackenzie, his experienced eye noting the guard's perfect posture and immaculate uniform details. But something in the king's demeanor suggested heightened tension, the pressure of a new monarch determined to prove himself worthy of the crown he'd waited 7 decades to wear. The morning sun caught the brass buttons and ceremonial sword, creating the kind of perfect visual moment that royal photographers dream about. But underneath the pageantry, both king and guard were acutely aware that they were about to participate in a ceremony where any mistake would be magnified by history and scrutiny. At precisely 10:30 a.m., the ceremonial procession began with the mathematical precision that had defined royal events for centuries. The household cavalry led the parade in their gleaming breastplates and plumed helmets, their horses stepping in perfect synchronization down the mall toward Westminster Palace. Behind them, the Irish state coach, carrying King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla, rolled forward with the measured pace of constitutional tradition, every wheel rotation timed to arrive at Parliament at the exact moment prescribed by protocol. Lance. Sergeant Mackenzie maintained his position at the palace grand entrance. His role now shifted to ceremonial guardian of the monarch's departure point. According to detailed instructions rehearsed dozens of times, he was to remain at perfect attention until the royal procession cleared the palace gates, then execute a precise about-turn and march to his secondary position for the king's return. These movements weren't suggestions. They were military orders embedded in centuries of tradition, as unchangeable as the constitutional monarchy itself. But at 10:43 a.m., 13 minutes into the perfectly choreographed ceremony, something went wrong. A mounted officer in the household cavalry, perhaps distracted by the crowds or nervous about his horse's behavior in the television lights, veered slightly left instead of maintaining his assigned position. The deviation was minor, perhaps 18 inches. But in the mathematical precision of royal ceremony, 18 inches might as well have been 18 feet. The horse's movement created a ripple effect through the formation, causing a momentary confusion that lasted no more than 15 seconds, but felt like an eternity to everyone involved. King Charles, visible through the state coach's glass panels, noticed the disruption immediately. His decades of ceremonial experience allowed him to spot flaws that would be invisible to casual observers, and this morning, with the pressure of his first major state occasion weighing on his mind, every imperfection felt magnified. The king's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but Mackenzie, trained to observe royal demeanor for any sign of required adjustment, caught the subtle change in His Majesty's posture. The procession continued, but Charles's attention remained focused on ceremonial details with the intensity of someone who understood that perfection was not just preferred, but essential. Royal ceremonies weren't performances. They were constitutional acts with legal significance, and every element had to be executed flawlessly to maintain the dignity and authority of the crown. A stumbling horse or confused guardsman could become international news, analyzed and criticized by media outlets worldwide as evidence of declining standards or inadequate preparation. As the state coach approached the palace gates, another minor disruption occurred. A tourist in the front row of spectators, apparently overwhelmed by the spectacle, shouted, "God save the king!" at the wrong moment in the ceremony. The outburst was well-intentioned, but violated the careful timing of the event, and several other spectators followed suit with their own shouts and applause. Within seconds, what should have been a moment of dignified silence had become an impromptu demonstration that threw off the ceremonial cadence. Mackenzie remained at perfect attention, but he could see through his peripheral vision that royal staff members were exchanging concerned glances. Assistant Private Secretary David Hamilton approached the area near Mackenzie's position, clipboard in hand, clearly preparing to make some kind of adjustment to the ceremony. The disruptions were minor by any reasonable standard, but in the context of royal protocol, they represented the kind of chaos that had to be managed immediately before it cascaded into more serious problems. It was at this moment that King Charles made an unprecedented decision. Instead of continuing with the ceremony as planned, he signaled for the state coach to slow down, then stop entirely just outside the palace gates. This deviation from the scheduled procession was so unexpected that it took several seconds for the supporting elements, the household cavalry, the police escorts, the television crews, to adjust their positions accordingly. Charles stepped out of the state coach, an action that was absolutely not part of the planned ceremony. His decision to exit the vehicle transformed what had been a carefully choreographed procession into an improvised royal walkabout, complete with the constitutional implications that came with any unscripted royal action. Palace security immediately shifted into heightened alert mode, while royal staff scrambled to understand what His Majesty intended to accomplish with this sudden change in protocol. The king walked directly toward Mackenzie's position, his ceremonial naval uniform and the weight of constitutional authority making his approach both impressive and intimidating. Charles's expression was controlled but determined, the look of someone who had decided that immediate action was necessary to address the ceremonial disruptions that had been building throughout the morning. "Sergeant," Charles said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 1,000 years of monarchical tradition, "I need you to clear this area of distractions. The ceremony must proceed without further interruptions." His words were polite, but unmistakably a direct command from the sovereign to a member of his military forces, the kind of order that had historically been followed without question or hesitation. Mackenzie found himself in an impossible position that no amount of military training had prepared him for. His orders from his commanding officers were explicit: maintain ceremonial position and execute prescribed movements according to established protocol. But now the king himself was issuing a contradictory command that would require him to abandon his assigned duties and take actions that fell outside his military authority. The tension of the moment was amplified by the dozens of witnesses surrounding them: royal staff, security personnel, photographers, and television crews that were broadcasting the entire scene to millions of viewers worldwide. Whatever Mackenzie decided to do in the next few seconds would be recorded, analyzed, and remembered as either an example of perfect military discipline or a constitutional crisis in miniature. Mackenzie's military training had taught him that orders from superior officers were to be followed without question, but his ceremonial training had taught him that royal protocol superseded individual preferences, even royal preferences. His role as a Queen's Guard was to embody the traditions and procedures that had been developed over centuries to ensure the dignity and consistency of royal ceremonies, regardless of momentary pressures or preferences. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably less than 10 seconds, As Mackenzie processed the implications of his response, and Charles waited for the immediate compliance he was accustomed to receiving from military personnel. The moment had become a test of constitutional principles, military discipline, and personal integrity that would define both men's understanding of their respective roles in the modern monarchy. Lance Sergeant Mackenzie stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats that seemed to last 3 hours, his mind processing a situation that existed in the gap between military law and royal prerogative. Around him, the organized chaos of a disrupted ceremony continued. Palace staff whispered urgently into radios, photographers captured every moment, and television commentators struggled to explain to millions of viewers why the king had suddenly stopped the state opening procession to address a single guardsman. When Mackenzie finally spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone who understood that his next words would be analyzed by constitutional scholars and military historians for decades to come. "Your Majesty," he said, maintaining perfect attention while addressing the sovereign directly, "I am under orders from my commanding officer to maintain this position until the ceremony is complete. I respectfully request permission to fulfill my assigned duties." The response was so unexpected, so perfectly balanced between military discipline and constitutional respect, that it took Charles several seconds to process what he'd just heard. In his 74 years, including decades of royal duties, he'd never had a military officer politely refuse a direct royal command while simultaneously demonstrating absolute respect for the crown. Mackenzie had managed to say no to the king while saying yes to the monarchy, a distinction that revealed both constitutional wisdom and remarkable personal courage. Charles's initial reaction was visible frustration. The disruptions to the ceremony had been building his tension throughout the morning, and he'd expected his direct intervention to solve the problem immediately. The idea that a sergeant would respectfully but firmly decline a royal command was so far outside his experience that it momentarily left him uncertain how to respond. The king was accustomed to suggestions being treated as orders and preferences being fulfilled without question. But as Charles processed Mackenzie's words, his understanding of the situation began to shift. The guardsman wasn't defying royal authority. He was upholding the military discipline that made royal ceremonies possible in the first place. Mackenzie's refusal to abandon his post was actually an act of service to the crown, protecting the institutional integrity that gave royal commands their meaning and power. Assistant Private Secretary David Hamilton approached carefully, his clipboard forgotten as he witnessed an unprecedented moment in modern royal history. Hamilton had orchestrated hundreds of royal ceremonies over his career, but he'd never seen a direct constitutional conflict between royal prerogative and military protocol play out in real time, especially with television cameras broadcasting every word to international audiences. "Sir," Hamilton said quietly to the king, "perhaps we should continue with the scheduled ceremony. The sergeant is following established protocol." His words were diplomatic but carried an implicit message. The guardsman was correct, and the king's frustration, while understandable, was creating a problem rather than solving one. Mackenzie remained at perfect attention throughout this exchange, but his peripheral vision caught the reactions of other palace staff and security personnel. Some looked shocked at his refusal to immediately comply with a royal command. Others nodded slightly, recognizing that he'd handled an impossible situation with remarkable grace. The moment had become a test case for how the modern monarchy balanced traditional authority with institutional procedures. King Charles took a deep breath, and in that pause, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of his role as constitutional monarch. He'd spent his entire adult life preparing to be king, but this moment was teaching him something that no amount of preparation could have provided: the difference between commanding respect and earning it, between royal authority and institutional wisdom. "Sergeant Mackenzie," Charles said, his tone now carrying curiosity rather than frustration, "explain to me why your orders supersede my request." It was an extraordinary question for a monarch to ask, essentially inviting a subordinate to educate him about the constitutional limits of royal power. Mackenzie's response demonstrated why the British military's tradition of producing thinking soldiers had served the nation well for centuries. "Your Majesty, My orders come from the chain of military command, which serves the crown through established procedures. If I abandon my post at royal request, it would suggest that ceremonies can be changed by royal preference rather than military discipline. This would undermine the reliability that makes royal ceremonies meaningful. The explanation was delivered with perfect military bearing, but revealed sophisticated understanding of constitutional monarchy. Mackenzie was essentially explaining to the king that royal authority was most powerful when it worked through established institutions rather than around them. His refusal to break protocol was actually protecting the system that gave royal commands their legitimacy and power. Charles's expression shifted from frustration to something approaching admiration. Here was a sergeant who understood constitutional monarchy better than many politicians, who grasped that the crown's authority came from its consistency rather than its spontaneity. Mackenzie had managed to teach the king a crucial lesson about leadership while never breaking character as a loyal subject and dedicated soldier. The television cameras captured every moment of this extraordinary exchange, but the audio was too distant for viewers to hear the specific words being spoken. Royal commentators scrambled to explain what appeared to be an intense conversation between monarch and guardsman, unaware that they were witnessing a masterclass in constitutional theory delivered by a 28-year-old soldier to a 74-year-old king. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes, Charles stepped back and nodded to Mackenzie with unmistakable respect. "Carry on, Sergeant," he said, using the military phrase that acknowledged both Mackenzie's correctness and his own understanding of the situation. The king had learned something crucial about the difference between commanding and leading, between royal authority and institutional wisdom. As Charles returned to the state coach and the ceremony resumed its planned course, Mackenzie remained at perfect attention, but something had changed in the dynamic between monarch and military. The king had demonstrated that he could learn and adapt, while the guardsman had shown that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to respectfully resist. Both men had emerged from the confrontation with enhanced understanding of their roles and deeper respect for the institutional framework they served. The state opening of Parliament continued flawlessly from that point forward, but palace insiders knew they'd witnessed something unprecedented. A moment when constitutional theory became constitutional practice. When the abstract concepts of limited monarchy and institutional independence became real through the courage of one guardsman and the wisdom of one king who was humble enough to learn from his subordinate. The immediate aftermath of the unprecedented exchange between King Charles III and Lance Sergeant Mackenzie played out in the careful, measured way that royal protocols are designed to handle unexpected situations. The state opening of Parliament proceeded without further incident, but palace insiders knew that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the monarchy and the military institutions that served it. Within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton found himself in the unusual position of briefing the king on a constitutional moment that had no historical precedent in the modern era. "Your Majesty," Alderton said carefully, "Sergeant Mackenzie's response was technically correct according to military regulations. His commanding officers have confirmed that his duty was to maintain his assigned position regardless of other instructions, including royal preferences." Charles listened with the focused attention of someone processing a significant learning experience. The morning's events had forced him to confront assumptions about royal authority that he'd held his entire adult life. Mackenzie's respectful but firm explanation had revealed gaps in his understanding of how constitutional monarchy actually functioned when abstract theory met real-world situations. "The sergeant demonstrated remarkable constitutional awareness," Charles replied thoughtfully. "He understood something about the monarchy that I'm still learning, that royal authority is most powerful when it works through established systems, rather than around them." It was an extraordinary admission for a monarch to make, acknowledging that he'd been educated by a subordinate about the proper limits and applications of his own power. The palace's response to the incident required delicate handling. Media outlets had captured the unusual interaction between king and guardsman, and royal correspondents were speculating about everything from ceremonial disputes to constitutional crises. The official statement, crafted with typical diplomatic precision, described the exchange as His Majesty taking personal interest in ceremonial details and receiving professional military guidance from experienced personnel. But privately, palace staff were processing the broader implications of what they'd witnessed. Mackenzie's response had demonstrated that the British military's tradition of producing thinking soldiers extended beyond battlefield tactics to constitutional principles. His ability to respectfully resist royal pressure while maintaining absolute loyalty to the crown revealed a sophisticated understanding of institutional relationships that impressed even seasoned palace veterans. Lance Sergeant Mackenzie returned to his regular duties without fanfare, but word of his handling of the unprecedented situation spread through military channels with the speed that significant events achieve in close-knit professional communities. His regimental commanders confirmed that he'd acted correctly according to both military regulations and constitutional principles, but they also recognized that he'd displayed remarkable personal courage in a situation that could have easily gone wrong. 3 weeks after the state opening incident, King Charles requested a private meeting with Sergeant Mackenzie, an unusual but not unprecedented step for a monarch who wanted to understand his military better. The meeting took place in the King's private office at Buckingham Palace, away from ceremonial settings and media attention, creating space for a conversation between two professionals who'd learned something important about their respective roles. "Sergeant," Charles began, "your response during the state opening demonstrated something I needed to understand about leadership and institutional respect. I wanted to thank you for the education you provided and to better understand the military perspective on royal ceremonies." The acknowledgement was gracious, but also significant. A constitutional monarch acknowledging that he'd learned something crucial from a subordinate about the proper exercise of royal authority. Mackenzie's response reflected the same thoughtful professionalism he'd demonstrated during the ceremony. "Your Majesty, military service to the Crown means preserving the systems that make royal authority meaningful. Sometimes that requires respectfully maintaining procedures even when it might seem easier to make exceptions." His explanation went to the heart of constitutional monarchy, the idea that royal power was most effective when it operated through established channels rather than around them. The private conversation lasted nearly an hour, ranging across topics from military tradition to constitutional theory to the practical challenges of modern monarchy. Charles emerged from the meeting with enhanced appreciation for the institutional wisdom embedded in military protocol, while Mackenzie gained deeper understanding of the pressures and responsibilities facing a modern constitutional monarch. 6 months later, the impact of their exchange became visible in subtle but significant changes to royal ceremonial procedures. New guidelines were established that clarified the relationship between royal preferences and military protocols, ensuring that future ceremonies would benefit from clear understanding of institutional roles and responsibilities. The changes were implemented quietly, without public announcements, but they represented a meaningful evolution in how the monarchy worked with its military partners. Mackenzie was promoted to Colour Sergeant ahead of schedule, a recognition not just of his military competence but of his constitutional wisdom and personal courage. The promotion came with assignment to the Royal Company, an elite unit responsible for the most significant ceremonial duties, including the protection of the monarch during major state occasions. King Charles's approach to royal ceremonies evolved as well, becoming more collaborative and institutionally aware. Palace staff noticed that he began consulting more extensively with military commanders about ceremonial procedures, seeking to understand the reasoning behind protocols rather than simply accepting them as traditions. His questions became more informed, his ceremonial participation more confident, and his relationship with military personnel more respectful of their professional expertise. The incident never became public knowledge in its full detail. Royal discretion and military professionalism combined to keep the constitutional education private, but its effects rippled through the broader relationship between crown and military. Training programs for royal staff began, including more extensive education about military protocols, while military ceremonial training incorporated greater emphasis on constitutional principles and respectful communication with royal principals. 2 years after the state opening incident, King Charles delivered a speech to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst that included a subtle but unmistakable reference to the lessons he'd learned about institutional respect and collaborative leadership. "The Crown serves best when it serves through the wisdom of the institutions that support it," he said, words that Mackenzie, watching from the audience as a newly commissioned officer, recognized as a public acknowledgement of their private constitutional moment. The story of their exchange became legend within military circles, not as an example of royal military conflict, but as a demonstration of how mutual respect and institutional wisdom could transform potential confrontation into educational opportunity. Mackenzie's courage in respectfully maintaining his duties, despite royal pressure, became a case study in military academies, while Charles's grace in learning from his subordinate became an example of enlightened leadership. The morning that had begun with ceremonial disruption and royal frustration had evolved into something unprecedented in modern constitutional history, a moment when monarch and soldier taught each other crucial lessons about authority, respect, and the institutional foundations that make democratic monarchy possible. Both men emerged from the experience as better servants of the crown they'd sworn to protect, and the monarchy itself emerged stronger for having leaders willing to learn from each other across the boundaries of rank and tradition. What do you think about the balance between authority and institutional wisdom? Have you ever had to respectfully stand your ground when pressured by someone in authority? Share your thoughts below. And if this story showed you something new about leadership and respect, pass it along to someone who might appreciate the lesson.